Shifting to the Eastern Conference, the Brooklyn Nets are back to full strength fully. Kyrie Irving just became eligible to play in home games. He made his home debut last night against the Charlotte Hornets at the Barclays Center. Nets ultimately lost to the Hornets 119-110. But I do think it's important to now look at this Brooklyn Nets team through a different lens and to examine them in a different way and ask the question, well, now that Kyrie Irving is eligible to play in home games, how does this impact their team? And obviously, there are a bevy of positives in this instance, but I do want to give credit first to LaMelo Ball because the guy's been absolutely sensational this year. Rookie of the year his first year, All-Star his second year, 33 points, 7 rebounds, 9 assists last night, collected the two biggest assists, two biggest plays, in my opinion, of the game last night. Set up P.J. Washington for a go-ahead layup, 107-106 with about 2 minutes to go. Then set up Cody Martin for a three to put him up 110-106. His leadership has been off the charts, and obviously the moxie and the confidence, the swagger that he plays with, he's infused this team with a new belief that has carried with them and has transcended them throughout this entire year. And I want to first give him credit for that. But obviously, as evidenced by last night, we can see how absolutely stacked and how deep this Eastern Conference really is. You have a two-way tie for first place between the Celtics and the Heat, both with the same record. You've got the Milwaukee Bucks and the Philadelphia 76ers just half a game back for the top overall spot. They're tied for third and fourth. You have the Bulls in the fifth spot. They're starting to get a little bit healthier, although Lonzo is still out for, I think, another 10 days, potentially. But you still have LaVine. You still have DeMar DeRozan, Vucevic, Caruso. They're back. So I think that when the Chicago Bulls are healthy, they can be a tricky out. They kind of are zigzagging when everyone is going in a linear path. You don't really know what you're going to get from the Chicago Bulls. I mean that in a good way. And the shockers of the season, the fact that Toronto and the Cleveland Cavaliers are currently jockeying for 6th and 7th in the Eastern Conference. One of those teams is going to be a surefire playoff team in the 6th spot. The other is going to be a part of the play-in, but more by virtue of the fact that you can only have 6 teams as opposed to 7. Otherwise, if it was guaranteed 7, both of those teams are about 3.5, 4 games clear of 8, 9, and 10 in the Eastern Conference. And that's where you get into the play-in aspect of things, which has the Charlotte Hornets and the Nets currently tied for 8th, but the Hornets just beat the Nets last night. So they are currently in the 8th spot. The Nets are in the 9th spot, and then the Hawks are right behind them in the 10th spot. But as is the case in so many competitions and so many sports, it's all about matchups. And that's what I think is going to be the difference for the Brooklyn Nets is who are they matched up against? Because if you look at the seedings and you look at the standings and you look at the personnel on each of those teams, to me, the one team that if you're the Brooklyn Nets, you're trying to avoid, not deliberately, but you likely want to avoid, is the Milwaukee Bucks. I don't think they match up particularly well against the Milwaukee Bucks. And I think that if they were to see the Bucks in the first or second round, they'd be knocked out in that round at this current moment in time. But with that being said, I think that if you look at the Miami Heat and you look at the Philadelphia 76ers, now that the mayor of New York, Eric Adams, amended that private sector mandate, which in the past prohibited athletes and performers from participating in local venues, from playing in local venues. Now that he's lifted that and he's amended that, and now that Kyrie is eligible to play at the Barclays Center. Well, I think that actually changes things a lot against those two teams in particular. Because the Philadelphia 76ers, I think we saw a little blueprint of how that series could go. Now, I'm not suggesting that every game would be as lopsided as it was a couple weeks ago when the Nets won 129-100, but I do think it paved the way a little bit, gave us a brief sample of how the Nets could ultimately take down the 76ers. Obviously, Joel Embiid is going to be a matchup nightmare for anyone, and he's going to eat against the Brooklyn Nets. But I think that the Nets can withstand his talent, especially given the uncertainty around James Harden in the postseason. We're just not sure which one we're going to get. And I think that's important to think about and to remember. Now, I like Tyrese Maxey. Danny Green's hot and cold. Do I want Korkmaz being my best shooter from the perimeter in the postseason now that you don't have Seth Curry? I don't really know if I trust that so much down the stretch. So I like the matchup against the Philadelphia 76ers, and I like it against the Miami Heat as well. Now, it's not because I want to throw shade at the Miami Heat. I think it's just because we're not sure which version of the Miami Heat we're going to get. If we get the Miami Heat, where they're clicking on all cylinders, Hero, Robinson, Butler, Bam, they're all playing like all-stars, and PJ Tucker is shutting down KD. Well, yeah, this makes this team a lot more dangerous. The problem is if Tyler Hero, who's having a sensational third season and is probably the front runner for Sixth Man of the Year, if he is having to be your best offensive weapon and your best offensive option against the Brooklyn Nets because maybe Jimmy Butler is struggling and Robinson can't hit from the perimeter, well, that's concerning to me. That's a bit concerning to me because we've seen from a talent perspective, Kyrie and KD can go up against anyone. They are so explosive that those two guys individually can win you games and win you series. So that's not the problem. They're not going to fear anyone in the Eastern Conference. And to be honest, that also includes the Milwaukee Bucks. Those two guys don't fear the Milwaukee Bucks. But I do think that certain matchups make fights. And against a Miami Heat team that I think would feel so pressed to keep up with the Nets offensively, that because of the pressure that the Nets apply so much because of how prolific they are on offense, I do think that could take a toll and eventually kind of wear down on the Miami Heat potentially. So I don't love that matchup for them. Duncan Robinson hasn't been quite as good as he's been the last couple of years. I know he's still averaging 11 points, 37% from the three-point line. I get it, but he hasn't been as consistent as he's typically been, which is a bit concerning. So I actually like the Nets in those two series. I'd be worried if I was Brooklyn against the Boston Celtics. I think they'd be a really tough out this year just because of how elite they are defensively. They're the number one defensive team in the NBA. They've held opponents to the lowest field goal percentage, lowest three-point percentage. They've got the second best point differential in the league. Ime Udoka has them flying around. They're starting to actually use their length at the wing position to their advantage. They play hellacious defense. My only concern about the Celtics is with Robert Williams and his knee. He just sprained his knee, and he's kind of the anchor defensively for this team. And he's also just a huge presence, a huge difference maker on the interior. What he provides as far as rebounding and shot blocking and lob threats and his ability to switch out onto guards. He just mans the middle. He mans the paint so well that without him, that eliminates a huge threat defensively for the Celtics. And so I'm just not sure how healthy he is. That's a little bit concerning to me. But when I look at the Brooklyn Nets right now, and currently they're tied for 8th. Let's just say, for the sake of argument, that the standings are what they are. And Brooklyn's got to play in the play-in tournament, which they will. Let's just say that they manage to get all the way up to the 7th spot. They win both games in the play-in. They move up to the 7th spot. So they would face the Miami Heat in the first round and then the Milwaukee Bucks in the second round. So I think they beat the Heat in the first round, and I think they'd probably lose to the Bucks in the second round. Now, if they remain in the 8th spot, then they'll take on the Celtics in the first round. I think they would narrowly beat them in 7 games. Then they face the 76ers in the second round. I think they'd win that. And by that point, you've reached the Eastern Conference Finals, and who knows? It depends on who you play. So the ceiling is through the roof for the Nets. Those 2 guys alone can catapult this team to an NBA Finals appearance, but they could also flame out in the second round or the first round, depending on who they play. And that's what this really comes down to. It's all about the matchups to me. So that's what it depends. That's going to be the difference. But I do think it's a game changer to have Kyrie be able to play in home games. I think it lessens the burden on Kyrie substantially. And I think you're going to start to see this team play with a little bit more freedom to experiment now that they have their full team for the final 8 games. Again, barring injury, this team's got an incredibly high ceiling where I do think they can reach the NBA Finals or at least the Eastern Conference Finals. But if they face the Bucks a little bit earlier on, I don't love that matchup for them. I really don't. I really don't.